Good evening, everyone. Wonderful to see you here. I'm Martin Dean. I direct the Institute of Sacred Music. Great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Lana Schwebel lecture. Great pleasure and honor to welcome Adam Kirsch to learn more about Adam Kirsch, so you don't know who he is. But my colleague Chris Wyman will fill in the blanks. This lectureship was established by the family of Professor Lana Schwebel. Lana was on our religion literature faculty at ISN and YDS for a number of years. She died tragically in July of 2007, and we're very grateful to the Schwebel family and in her memory allows us to honor her in this way each year by bringing a leader in the area of literature and spirituality to campus. Great pleasure always to welcome Lizzie, Lana's sister, who's here with her husband Shalom. Always wonderful to see you, and our love to the rest of the family back home. This Schwebel lectureship has in fact brought some of the great writers and thinkers about writing to our campus. Names like Robert Alter, who was our inaugural lecturer in December 2008, Robert Pinsky, Christian Wyman, our own colleague Christian Wyman, Helen Whitney, Peter Cole, Fanny Hull, Marilyn Robinson, on the list goes. And it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to bring this talent and also to remember our dear colleague. Give you a little insight into Lana Schwebel and the impact she had on this community. I like to call my friend and colleague Lisa Huck, who's registered at Yale Divinity School, to say one word about her.
Well, I first met Lana Schwebel on the telephone. It was, I suppose, the summer of 2002, just before she came to Yale Divinity School in the ISM. I was at the time the manager of the Divinity School bookstore, and she was a brand new faculty member calling to talk about textbook ordering. Ordinarily, with any other professor, this probably would have been a 5 or 10 minute conversation. It was with Lana, I think, about an hour and a half. It's 15 years ago, but I can still remember that the conversation ranged from art history, literature in general, Robertson Davies and Michael Malone in particular, Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, chocolate, and probably textbook ordering. By the time we said goodbye, we both knew that we had found a new friend. A few months later, when I had met her in person and she had met both me and the bookstore, we had what we came to call our Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland moment. She had an ISM grant to do something with literature and spirituality. The bookstore had a warm and cozy space in which to hold events. Let's put on a show. We can use my father's barn. And such was the birth of the ISM Literature and Spirituality series. Lana was a remarkable person, and I miss her still. Smart, quick-witted, funny as all get out, buoyant and full of life. Lover of words, lover of random facts, lover of all manner of pie. That's P-I-E, not P-I, although I don't know about the other, perhaps. Reading one of her course syllabi was both education and entertainment. She loved teaching, and she loved her students, and they in turn loved her right back. She was an incredibly engaging storyteller. Her smile made you feel warm inside. She was a kind and generous friend. I didn't know her long enough, but I'm extremely grateful for the years that I got to be her friend. And I'm grateful, too, for the opportunity to share just a little bit of her with you tonight. So thank you, Martin, and thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Please stay after the lecture today for a brief reception out in the area just here. And also one shameless bit of advertising. The ISM sponsors a student-curated journal of literature and spirituality. There's a flyer just outside the door. It's called Letters, and they're open for submissions right now. So please look into that if you will. Here's Chris.
Welcome, everyone. I've been reading Adam Kirsch with great admiration for 20 years now, since he was an undergraduate at Harvard, in fact. And he first started publishing these fiercely independent, uncompromising, and quite controversial essays on contemporary poetry in the New Republic, and other places, but mostly in the New Republic. He's come a long way since then. He's got 10 books, at least 10 books, on a wide range of subjects. He's got 3 books of his own memorable chiseled poems, hundreds of articles in places like the New Yorker, the Atlantic, New York Review of Books, Tablet, on and on. He's a former Guggenheim Fellow, and he currently runs the graduate program, he's on hiatus here, for the Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia. As I say, he's come a long way, but what I still admire the very most about Adam is unchanged. It's that absolute independence of mind, the moral imagination that never relaxes into platitudes or certitudes, the capaciousness of his reach and curiosity, and most of all, the courage. Adam's last book of poems is called Emblems of the Passing World, and it's a series of responses to, or interpretations of, the photographs of the 20th century photographer August Sander. I don't think he's going to read anything from that, no. But I do commend it to all of you. We just spent a couple hours talking about it with my undergraduate class, which was wonderful. It's a brilliant book. It's a lonely book, and yet it's also, I find, weirdly consoling. I bring it up because there's a poem, which we actually talked about in class, about this Icelandic scholar who lived in a time when, as the poem says, even minds are mobilized, and even the most apparently innocent professions and gifts were given over to war. In Adam's poem, the scholar alone retains some integrity, quote, having done nothing but to gaze into the northern distance where the skald recites his song of praise guiltlessly to the frozen air. It's an act of pure attention and intelligence, and ultimately courage. Adam would never associate it with himself, but I can. And I suspect many of you will too after you hear it. Please welcome Adam Kirsch.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Chris, and thank you for having me here tonight and for being here. It's really an honor. I'm going to talk tonight about the subject, who wants to be a Jewish writer? And I'm going to start with a sort of historical, literary critical themes, and then talk a bit about myself towards the end. So several years ago, I moderated a discussion between 2 novelists at the Museum of Jewish History in downtown Manhattan. The setting seemed appropriate, especially to people who organized the event, since these were Jewish writers who wrote about Jewish characters and themes. I had reviewed both of their books in Tablet, which is an online Jewish magazine. But when I asked the novelists if they considered themselves Jewish writers, both answered emphatically in the negative. They were American writers who happened to be Jewish and happened to write about Jews, but Jewish writer was a label they had no interest in. I wasn't surprised by the answer. I had asked the question because I expected it. After all, Philip Roth himself once told an interviewer, "The epithet American Jewish writer has no meaning for me. If I'm not an American, I'm nothing." If the author of Goodbye Columbus, Portnoy's Complaint, and Operation Shylock, probably the most profound, obsessive books ever written about what it means to be an American Jew, doesn't want to be thought of as a Jewish writer, why should anyone else claim the description? And the truth is that many of the most accomplished American Jewish writers have not claimed it. Saul Bellow spoke in similar terms. "I'm often described as a Jewish writer," he wrote in 1974. In much the same way, one might be called a Samoan astronomer, or an Eskimo cellist, or a Zulu Gainsborough expert. There is some oddity about it. I am a Jew and I have written some books. I have tried to fit my soul into the Jewish writer category, but it does not feel comfortably accommodated there. There is, of course, one very good reason why writers would want to avoid the Jewish writer category: simple math. There are 320 million Americans, of whom about 5 million are Jewish. If one assumes that only Jews want to read Jewish fiction, then announcing oneself as a Jewish writer immediately means cutting off about 98% of your potential readers. But the math isn't quite that conclusive, since it has never been true that only Jews read books by Jewish writers. Certainly, it wasn't true half a century ago, during what now looks like the golden age of American Jewish writing. This was a time when writers like Bellow and Roth and Malamud reached the bestseller list and won major literary prizes while writing unapologetically Jewish books such as Herzog and The Magic Barrel. This literary moment, which lasted from roughly the 1950s to the 1970s, can be explained by two factors. First was the decline of anti-Semitism that followed the Holocaust, which lowered the barriers of entry to the literary and academic professions and made Jews an object of more sympathetic interest. Second, and probably more important, was the coming of age of the first native-born generation of American Jews, writers born in the 19-teens and 20s whose parents had come to the United States during the great wave of Eastern European immigration before the First World War. For these Jews, the emphasis on literacy and textual mastery that had always defined Jewish intellectual life took on dramatically new forms. That's because the Jewish immigration to America marked a profound break in the chain of transmission of Jewish texts, a chain that went back more than 50 generations. In his 1917 novel, The Rise of David Levinsky, often described as the first American Jewish novel, Abraham Kahn tells the story of a Jewish immigrant who finds his early Talmudic education slipping away from him in the New World. With an eye to the non-Jewish reader, Kahn has David Levinsky, his narrator, summarize the importance of Talmud study in Eastern European Jewish life. A Talmudic education was, until recent years, practically the only kind of education a Jewish boy of old-fashioned parents received. I spent 7 years at it, not counting the several years of Talmud which I had had at the various cheters, which are elementary schools. What is the Talmud? It is at once a fount of religious inspiration and a brain sharpener. We were sure that the highest mathematics taught at Gentile universities were child's play compared to the Talmud. But the Talmud has already begun to lose its power for David Levinsky before he leaves the old country. The murder of his mother in a pogrom drives thoughts of study from his mind and encourages him to start thinking of emigration. When he's departing for America, a rich woman who had been his sponsor meets him at the train station. "Here," she said, handing me a 10-ruble bill and a package. "There's a boiled chicken in it and some other things, provided you won't neglect your Talmud in America." Yet neglected he does, inevitably. The very brain sharpening that Talmud study provided helps him to acquire other secular kinds of knowledge which prove more useful in America, such as learning English. And while David Levinsky never loses his love for the Talmud, over time, his connection with it is broken, as the energies that once went into textual study are now employed to make a fortune in the garment business. Accordingly, in the generation after Abraham Kahn's, the first American-born generation, it was a rare American Jewish writer who grew up with any knowledge of or fondness for Jewish study. The one example that comes to mind is Herman Wouk, who in addition to novels like The Cain Mutiny, also wrote This Is My God, a popular introduction to Judaism. But Judaism as an intellectual tradition was largely a closed book to this generation. When the critic Lionel Trilling answered a questionnaire from the Contemporary Jewish Record in 1944, he spoke for most of his fellow New York Jewish intellectuals when he wrote, "I cannot discover anything in my professional intellectual life which I can specifically trace back to my Jewish birth and rearing. I do not think of myself as a Jewish writer. I do not have it in mind to serve by my writing any Jewish purpose." Trilling connected this lack of interest in Jewishness with what seemed to him the barrenness of Judaism itself. "Modern Jewish religion," he wrote, "at its best may indeed be intelligent and soaked in university knowledge, but out of it there has not come a single voice with the note of authority, of philosophical or poetic or even rhetorical, let alone of religious authority." Ironically, Trilling himself would later be described by the writer Philip Rieff as the archetypal Jew of culture, a man whose wisdom, moral seriousness, and commitment to textual study marked him as a 20th century version of an ancient Jewish type. Yet this Jewishness remained a matter of resemblance, of form, not of content or substance. For Trilling and other Jewish critics and scholars of his generation, the intellectual ambitions that earlier generations had directed towards Jewish texts were now redirected to English and American literature, with dramatic results. In 1942, the critic Alfred Kazin published his first book, a study of American fiction titled On Native Grounds, and the title itself made a clear point. Jews were now natives of the United States. They belonged to American literature, and American literature belonged to them. Some Jews themselves were amused by the forthrightness of Kazin's claim. When Kazin made reference in an article about the American West in Partisan Review to our forests, the editor of the magazine, Philip Rov, teased him. Our forests, Alfred? But Rov had been born in Russia, and Kazin was born in Brooklyn, and that made all the difference. America was an inheritance that these immigrants were determined to claim, and claim it they did. In the decades after World War II, many of the leading critics and scholars of English and American literature were Jews, from Kazin and Trilling to Leslie Fiedler, Harry Levin, and M.H. Abrams, the creator of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. This success might make it difficult for us today to recognize how unlikely the Jewish entry into American letters once seemed. But consider how things looked to Henry James in 1904, when he paid a visit to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, then the most densely populated Jewish neighborhood in the world. To James, the presence of so many Jews on American soil was not exactly a cause for celebration, as he wrote in a well-known passage in The American Scene. There is no swarming like that of Israel when once Israel has got a start, and the scene here bristled at every step with the signs and sounds, immitigable, unmistakable, of a Jewry that had burst all bounds. That it has burst all bounds in New York, almost any combination of figures or of objects taken at hazard sufficiently proclaims. But I remember how the rising waters on this summer night rose to the imagination even above the housetops and seemed to sound their murmur to the pale, distant stars. It was as if we had been thus in the crowded, hustled roadway where multiplication of everything was the dominant note, at the bottom of some vast, sallow aquarium in which innumerable fish of overdeveloped proboscis were to bump together forever amid heaped spoils of the sea. Now, this plangent Jamesian lament, very much in his style, complete with reference to big noses, was only heightened by his anticipation of what these Yiddish-speaking immigrants and their descendants were going to do to his beloved English language. He envisioned the American writer, which for James, of course, meant a writer of Anglo-Saxon stock, as a defender of the honor of English against what he called, ominously, the accent of the future. He wrote, "It was in the light of letters, that is, in the light of our language, as literature has hitherto known it, that one stared at this all-unconscious impudence of the agency of future ravage. The man of letters in the United States has his own difficulties to face and his own current to stem, for dealing with which his liveliest inspiration may be, I think, that they are still very much his own, even in an Americanized world, and that more than elsewhere they press him to intimate communion with his honor. For that honor, the honor that sits astride the consecrated English tradition, to his mind quite as old knighthood astride of its caparisoned charger, the dragon most rousing over the land, the proper spirit of St. George, is just this immensity of the alien presence, climbing higher and higher, climbing itself into the very light of publicity." Far from being dragons, however, it turned out that American Jewish writers only wanted to be knights themselves. It was Leon Edel, another Jewish scholar, who wrote James's biography in 5 volumes. The anti-Semitism of writers like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound did not stop Jews from becoming some of their greatest enthusiasts and expositors. And after World War II, when even genteel anti-Semitism fell into disrepute by association with Nazism, the establishment began to reciprocate that affection. In his 1959 book, Life Studies, Robert Lowell, whose relatives included the 19th century poet James Russell Lowell and the Harvard president A. Lawrence Lowell, began an account of his family history by focusing on a very different ancestor. This is from the prose section of that book, 91 Revere Street. The account of him is platitudinous, worldly, and fond, but he has no Christian name, and is entitled merely Major M. Myers, in my cousin Cassie Mason Myers' privately printed biographical sketches. The nameplate under his portrait used to spell out his name bravely enough. He was Mordecai Myers. Undoubtedly, Major Mordecai had lived in a more ritualistic, gaudy, and animal world than 20th century Boston. There was something undecided, Mediterranean, versatile, almost double-faced about his bearing. He was a dark man, a German Jew. In the anarchy of my adolescent war on my parents, I tried to make him a true wolf, the wandering Jew. Clearly, whatever it was that Jewishness represented to Lowell, some kind of gaudy and animal alternative to proper Boston, some productive estrangement from the American norm, made it an identity worth cherishing. Indeed, by the 1970s, Henry James's complaint had begun to change into its opposite. Now, some Protestant writers felt that Jews had become only too solicitous of the honor and the honors of American literature. John Updike, whose rivals for literary glory included Bellow, J.D. Salinger, and Norman Mailer, wrote a series of books about a fictional Jewish writer called Henry Beck, which allowed him to imaginatively explore and critique the sudden prominence of American Jewish novelists. The book had not so much been about a Jew as about a writer who was a Jew with the same inevitability that a fictional rug salesman would be an Armenian, Updike explained in 1971. There's something unmistakably rude in this comparison. Just ask an Armenian how he would like to be stereotyped as a rug dealer. Even so, it pays homage to the surprising way in which Jews had become synonymous with American literature. Writing almost a century after James, however, Updike still clung to the idea that there was something profoundly incompatible about Jewishness and Americanness. This becomes clear in one of the last of the Beck stories, Beck Noir, in which Henry Beck takes his revenge on one Orlando Cohen, a famous Jewish critic. As Cohen is dying, he uses his last breath to denounce Beck as an inauthentic writer. You thought you could skip out of yourself and write American. Beck, let me ask you, can you say the Lord's Prayer? Well, 90% of the schlubs around you can. It's in their heads. They can rattle the damn thing right off. How can you expect to write about people when you don't have a clue to what's in their heads? They stuck it out, but that god-awful faith, when it burns out, it leaves a dead spot. That's where America is, in that dead spot. Emily, that guy in the woods, Hem, Mel, Haw, they were there. No in thunder, the big no. Jews don't know how to say no. All we know is yes. That's Updike as Cohen. In a century whose most famous Jewish writer was Kafka, the idea that Jews only know how to say yes is bizarre. But it goes directly to the heart of Updike's understanding of American literature. For Updike, tracing an intellectual lineage to Dickinson, Melville, and Hawthorne, what makes literature American is a post-Puritan, post-Protestant wrestle with the absence of a redeeming God. Jews, he suggests, as many had suggested before him, cannot in their bones understand this kind of American experience. They are too worldly to understand the American longing for transcendence. This is, of course, a recapitulation of the ancient Christian understanding going back to the Apostle Paul that Judaism is a religion of the letter while Christianity embraces the spirit. In her 1976 story, Levitation, however, Cynthia Ozick, another leading American Jewish writer of this period, put a different spin on that hostile equation. This story centers on a married couple, both second-rate novelists, one Jewish and one Christian. They decide to throw a party to advance their own careers, but fail to attract any of the A-listers they hoped for. Notably, these are all Jewish intellectuals and writers, such as Irving Howe, Susan Sontag, and Alfred Kazin. Instead, the focus of the gathering turns out to be an émigré professor who tells stories of his experiences in the Holocaust. As the Jewish guests flock around him, Ozick writes, something strange happens. The room begins to ascend. It lifted. It rose like an ark on waters. Lucy, this is the Christian wife, said inside her mind, "This chamber of Jews." It seemed to her that the room was levitating on the little grains of the refugee's whisper. She felt herself alone at the bottom, below the floorboards, while the room floated upward, carrying Jews. Why did it not take her, too? Here, it's the Jews who are spiritualized, literally rising in the air, in a Chagall-like magical realist touch, while the Christians remain bound to the earth and the flesh. It was the Holocaust, this parable suggests, that had endowed even American Jews who did not live through it with a kind of spiritual prestige. Auschwitz was a source of authenticity, an experience of the ultimate, before which outsiders felt bewilderment, tinged by envy. There's a definite truth in Ozik's insight. Just look at the way American Jewish identity in the years since she wrote has increasingly turned the Holocaust into a source of the sacred. But Ozik's magical realist image can also be read in other, more skeptical ways. The Levitating Jews are a pun on the Yiddish term Luftmensch, meaning someone who lives in the air, detached from worldly concerns like making a living. They also, of course, remind us of the fate of the Jews whose ashes were literally dispersed into the air of Poland. Ozik wants us to remember that levitation, being removed from connection with the earth itself by suffering, is not a desirable fate, even if from some angles it looks like an interesting one. As it happens, Ozik is the rare Jewish writer who has positively embraced a Jewish literary identity. Jewish experience, Jewish ethics, at times even Jewish theology, are the explicit subject of most of her great fiction. Yet precisely because she does want her work to be understood as a contribution to Jewish literature, Ozik is tormented by the barriers that separate American writers from Jewish tradition. In a 1970 essay titled Toward a New Yiddish, she provocatively writes, "There have been no Jewish literary giants in diaspora. There are no major works of Jewish imaginative genius written in any Gentile language, sprung out of any Gentile culture." By this, Ozik doesn't mean that there have been no great Jewish writers in non-Jewish languages. She knows Kafka and Bruno Schulz and Saul Bellow as well as anyone. Rather, she meant that when Jews write in non-Jewish languages, they are no longer writing out of a specifically Jewish imagination. This is an idea redolent of 19th century nationalism, which celebrated the mystic bond between nation, language, and writer. It's an unfamiliar idea in America, where the exchange of the ancestral language for English is a rite of passage for immigrant writers. But in Jewish tradition, the idea that language, specifically the Hebrew language, is an integral part of Jewish existence has very deep roots. For instance, in the Talmud, in Tractate Sotah, the rabbis debate whether it is possible to address God in Aramaic, which in their time was the lingua franca of the Near East and the daily language of most Jews. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it is not possible because the ministering angels are not familiar with the Aramaic language. But other rabbis note that on one occasion, the voice of God was heard to deliver a message to the high priest and in the temple in Jerusalem, and that voice spoke Aramaic. And the fact is that starting with the Babylonian exile, Hebrew has always been a foreign language to large segments of the Jewish population, including most women, since education in the Holy Tongue was usually restricted to men. The Gemara itself, of course, is written in Aramaic. That's one part of the Talmud. Many Greek-speaking Jews in the Roman Empire knew the Bible only in the Greek translation known as the Septuagint. This was true of Philo of Alexandria, the celebrated biblical commentator. These Jews cherished the legend that when King Ptolemy of Egypt imported 70 translators to render the Bible from Hebrew into Greek, each of the 70 emerged from seclusion having produced the exact same text, proof that the Septuagint was divinely inspired and perfect, just like the original. Again, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, the greatest work of medieval Jewish philosophy, was written in Arabic. So Ozik is wrong to insist that Jewish literature cannot exist outside of a Jewish language. Still, it's surely true that English is more like Greek than it is like Aramaic or Yiddish, the primary Jewish languages of the past. It's a world language in which Jews will never make up more than a tiny percentage of speakers. It has no roots in Jewish tradition or text. Equally important, it will never be a language in which Jews can talk to one another without the outside world listening in. To write in English, even about Jewish subjects, is necessarily to exchange one's place in an exclusively Jewish literary tradition for a place in the much broader, more diverse and cosmopolitan tradition of English literature. For most American Jewish writers, this seems like a very good trade. Certainly it represents a vast increase in potential readership, which is why Hebrew writers gain more from translation into English than vice versa. Yet there are other kinds of gains than sheer numbers. That's the point of an anecdote that Saul Bellow once told about his meeting in Jerusalem with S.Y. Agnon, the only Hebrew writer ever to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. Agnon asked Bellow if his own books had ever been translated into Hebrew. If they had not been, he had better see to it immediately, because, he said, they would survive only in the Holy Tongue. When Bellow replied that the Jewish poet Heinrich Heine seemed to have a pretty secure reputation despite writing in German, Agnon replied that Heine was safe since he had already been translated into Hebrew. This was a joke, but a pointed one. The number of people who understand Hebrew is small. There are about 5 million native speakers in Israel, and perhaps 4 million elsewhere who know the language with varying degrees of fluency. That's about the same as the population of New York City or of Sweden. English, on the other hand, is the native language of about 400 million people, and a second language to as many as 1 billion others, including many Israelis, and for that matter, many Swedes. It seems, to put it mildly, counterintuitive to say that a Hebrew text stands a better chance of survival than an English one. Yet the same thing could have been said of Latin 2,000 years ago, and who speaks Latin today? The earliest Hebrew texts have been read and circulated for some 3,000 years, and the core of the Jewish prayer service is substantially the same today as it was when the temple stood in Jerusalem. When words are lodged deeply enough in the heart of a people, they can stay alive for a fantastically long time and against great odds. Who knows if anyone will be reading Agnon or Bellow in 500 years' time, but if they are, I think it's certainly possible that they will be reading them in Hebrew. Yet, of course, it's not a calculation on posterity that determines what language a writer uses or what she writes about. The first decision about language is usually made for us. We write the language that we have grown up speaking. For American Jewish writers, that means English. Hebrew can be acquired, but only with great effort starting at an early age, which means in practical terms that it is only acquired by people with a strong religious background or a strong ideological incentive, like the early Zionists. Most young American Jews are lucky if they learn enough Hebrew to follow the prayer service. In my own case, although I went to Hebrew school programs for the ages of 5 to 18, I went to college without knowing enough Hebrew to ask directions, not to mention read Amos Oz. I would have had to start my education over again in a much more rigorous way if I was to achieve the ability to read Hebrew literature, and by then it was probably too late for me to hope to write in it. The reason it didn't even occur to me to make that choice has to do with the second decision I mentioned earlier, the decision regarding what to write about. This, too, is usually made for us, though in a different way. In my case, being a poet was what I hoped for, starting at the age of 16 or so. But like many of the writers I've quoted, being a Jewish writer would have seemed to me as a teenager to be a rather provincial limitation. When I look back and try to understand why this was, I try to recall how I felt about the poetry that inspired me at the time. This was American, English, sometimes French. I learned much more French in 4 years of high school than I ever learned Hebrew. But its subject was not religious or ethnic or national experience, it was universal human experience. Take the poem Green by Verlaine, which made a big impression on me when I first read it and tried to translate it at the age of 16. This is the first stanza in the translation by C.F. McIntyre. I give these flowers and fruits, these leafy sprays, and my heart also, throbbing for your sake, into your 2 white hands. Oh, do not break such poor gifts, nor your eyes deny them praise. Romantic love, tender devotion, the fear of rejection, these themes spoke to me directly at 16, and the patterns of the verse began to make sense to me as techniques that could be imitated and eventually mastered. To ask what any of this had to do with being Jewish would have made as much sense as asking what the taste of pepper had to do with the length of a mile, to borrow a comparison that Maimonides uses in the Guide of the Perplexed. Jewishness to me was a part of life, having to do with going to synagogue, going to Hebrew school, keeping dietary laws, and other discrete activities. The source of poetry went much deeper into what it meant to be human, to be alive. And I think this is what American Jewish writers are trying to express when they shun the label of Jewish writer. Writing, they mean to say, is about the fundamentals of life, things everybody can understand: love, hate, fear, desire, beauty. To call oneself a Jewish writer might seem to imply that one loves, hates, and so on in a different way from people who are not Jewish. And of course, this is not the case, any more than it is the case with any ethnic or religious distinction. Yet with other kinds of identity, it's taken for granted that the local is not in conflict with the universal, but it's precisely the way to reach the universal. When Joyce wrote about Dublin, or Faulkner wrote about the American South, they didn't anxiously insist that they were not Irish or Southern writers, just writers. They knew that it was only by describing a particular way of life with great specificity that they could make it humanly comprehensible, even to people who had led very different lives. Why do, or why did, Jewish writers not feel the same way? One answer is that they do feel the same way, they just don't want to admit it. After all, there have been few more carefully detailed milieus in American fiction than Philip Roth's Jewish Newark or Saul Bellow's Jewish Chicago. As writers, they knew that the Jewishness of their experience was identical to its humanness, not in competition with it. Take, for instance, this passage from Roth's novel Portnoy's Complaint, in which he describes football games at Wequahic High, the Jewish neighborhood school in Newark, whose fans would chant, "Ikey, Mikey, Jake, and Sam, we're the boys who eat no ham. We play football, we play soccer, we keep matzahs in our locker. I, Wequahic High." So what if we had lost? Roth continues. It turns out that we had other things to be proud of. We ate no ham. We kept matzahs in our lockers. Not really, of course, but if we wanted to, we could, and we weren't ashamed to say that we actually did. We were Jews, and we weren't ashamed to say it. We were Jews, and not only were we not inferior to the Goyim who beat us at football, but the chances were that because we could not commit our hearts to victory in such a thuggish game, we were superior. And what made us superior was precisely the hatred and the disrespect that they lavished so willingly upon us. There's no shying away from Jewishness here. Roth frankly lays out the psychic convolutions of being Jewish in 1940s America, the dialectic of superiority and inferiority, pride and shame. He does so with the expectation that any reader will be able to understand and even sympathize with this parochial phenomenon. Indeed, that was the great daring wager of Roth's fiction, a daring that went too far for some of his Jewish critics. Yet somehow the name of Jewish writer felt to Roth and many others like a restriction, a deprivation. The only way to explain this is to reckon with the ambiguous role that Jewishness plays in the lives of modern Jews, especially in the West and above all in America. This ambiguity is the product of our successful assimilation, which historically speaking is a recent and anomalous phenomenon. Jews in America do not speak a Jewish language, as our ancestors did. We don't live in exclusively Jewish communities, as our ancestors did. The majority of us do not observe Jewish laws, as our ancestors did. That last difference is the most significant from a religious perspective, but perhaps the least important from a literary perspective. Look, for instance, at the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who was born in Germany as Ludwig Pfeiffer and came to pre-state Israel as a teenager. Amichai, who led a secular life, can write about love and desire in a way that is as little marked by Jewishness as Verlaine's is by Frenchness. Take the poem To Break Up Now, translated here by Robert Alter. To break up now the words between us into sharp fragments, I won't ever be able to live without you, and to thrust them one by one into the other's heart. I won't ever be able to live, won't ever, without you, to live, won't. There's nothing about that poem that requires or suggests that it was written by a practicing, believing Jew. Judaism as a religion is irrelevant to it. Yet because it is written in Hebrew by an Israeli, and because it takes its place in a body of work that is intensely concerned with Jewish faith and history, no one would hesitate to call it a piece of Jewish literature. Yet the same poem, written by an American Jew in English, would belong to American literature. Unless, of course, the writer in question had made Jewishness a similarly central element in his or her work in general. In that case, the text might exfoliate with Jewish meanings in unexpected ways, perhaps even ways unexpected by the writer himself. Jewishness in American literature, that is, turns out to have the same elusive and perspectival quality that it has in American life. The same person might feel not at all Jewish when alone in a forest and very Jewish when in a synagogue, or vice versa. They might feel most Jewish when taking pride in Israel or when boycotting Israel. He might feel entirely American and think Jewishness irrelevant until he sees a campaign commercial for Donald Trump that singles out Jews as responsible for the globalist takeover of the United States. It's because our Jewishness is no longer a simple fact of language, community, or belief that it has become a matter of feeling. This might seem like an insubstantial kind of Jewishness, and perhaps it is. But it is the truth of our Jewish life, and any honest depiction of that life, through fiction or poetry or other means, has to include it. In that sense, an American Jewish writer's denial of Jewishness can be considered a representative Jewish act. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of questions. If anyone has questions for Adam?
No one wants to be the first ever to ask questions, but yes.
How do you feel about the poetry that's published in Poetry Magazine?
It's too diverse to generalize. I like some of it and don't like some of it, and it's pretty broad spectrum. I don't know if I could venture a guess on that.
Yes. It's much better with the editor. Because the old editor is sitting right there.
So
Yes.
I find this sort of interesting. You can't find any human writers until you finally about Cynthia Hazel, because in fact there are Jews in America who've been since the Revolution, like Emma Lazarus's family.
Yeah.
They come from, they fight back a lot against the kind of anti-Semitism that they saw. I mean, she wrote some pretty punching poems about that.
Yeah.
And I think, why call something Jewish or not Jewish? I mean, as you said, you're looking for universal things. I think there are strains of other things that are very similar. And many of the people in the United States have the same kind of prejudice toward them, like some of the Irish. So you might say that everybody is an outcast if they don't fit the quote mold of what we're supposed to think that we were, which we weren't.
Yeah, so the question is there something, does it make sense to talk about, for instance, being discriminated against as a distinctively Jewish experience when it's also been the experience of many other groups in America? I think that that's absolutely right, and there are a lot of commonalities in immigrant literature over time and in different groups. So if you looked at a book like The Rise of David Levinsky or Alfred Kazan's memoir, A Walker in the City, or other classics of Jewish American immigration literature, and compare them to books by Jhumpa Lahiri or Junot Diaz, there are definite continuities because the experience of immigration and assimilation is similar in some ways, but there are also important differences. And I think that the Jewish experience in America is different from that of most other immigrant groups because it's a religious identity as well as an ethnic identity. And so there's a question of deliberate, if there's an obligation to preserve Jewishness and Judaism in a way that's not incumbent on other ethnic groups in the same way. Yeah.
I can borrow a term that's sometimes been used to describe European intellectuals of Jewish extraction. Do you think there are any American Jewish writers we could call non-Jewish Jews?
So the term non-Jewish Jew or the non-Jewish Jew comes from an essay by Isaac Deutscher, who was a radical left communist writer and a biographer of Trotsky and a very significant writer in the mid-20th century. And he grew up in a traditional Orthodox Eastern European Hasidic household and ended up as a sort of communist agitator and orator. And he wrote an essay called The Non-Jewish Jew, in which he talked about this tradition of Jews who rejected Judaism and the particularism of Jewishness and became something else, something universal. And he talked about people like Heine and Kafka and Rosa Luxemburg. For him, this had a definite political feeling to it as well. I think that it's an interesting idea that appeals to certain people, certain Jews, particularly on the left, because it seems like a humanitarian idea. The idea that you're not interested only in the group that you happen to be born into, you're interested in humanity as a whole. And Rosa Luxemburg, the revolutionary, is one of the great examples of this. And there's a famous letter that she wrote when she was in prison, in a German prison during World War I, in which she said, why should I feel more sorry for the sorrows of the ghetto than I do for the Putumayo Indians? They're both related to me. They're both part of humanity. I think that in practical terms, and maybe even in not more than practical terms, that idea doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think that everyone starts from somewhere, right? There's no such thing as a human being. Everyone is a human being who is something, who is determined in some way. And the idea that it's particularly incumbent on Jews to be the only people that have no such identity seems to me very problematic. And I think that it's related to certain kinds of anti-Zionism as well. So the idea that Jews have a calling to be non-Jewish Jews or anti-Zionist Jews, and that's sort of the way that a Jew demonstrates their bona fides or their sort of moral integrity. One doesn't demand that of other groups and other religions, and I think that there's something impossible about that idea when you get to the bottom of it. Other questions? Yeah.
If I could just turn your subject on its head for a second.
Yeah.
I was curious whether you had found any interesting examples of writers who were not Jewish, but who would like to identify as a Jewish writer in a way.
It's an interesting question. I mean, so Updike is one example. I mean, Updike writes these series of books about Henry Beck in which he imagines what he thinks of as a Jewish writer's career in mid-century New York. And there are certainly non-Jewish writers who have been very influenced by the style of certain Jewish writers. I mean, if you look at like Dave Eggers' writing, he is very influenced by Saul Bellow, and you can see certain affinities between his books and Bellow's books. I don't know if you can go any farther than that, though. I think that there's stylistic affinities, but there's much more the other way. I mean, there are plenty of Jewish writers who don't write about Jewish subjects, and nothing is particularly gained by thinking of them as Jewish writers, but I don't know if it works the other way around. Yes?
On another topic, I wanted to ask you to just comment on your experience of writing the poems in response to photographs, and sort of what inspired that, and then how, now that you've done it, what has that sort of, how has that enlightened you or caused you to think about things differently?
Sure. Well, as Chris mentioned, I wrote this book called Emblems of the Passing World, which is a book of poems and photographs. The photographs are by a 20th century German photographer called August Sander, who took, he's a very famous photographer who took portraits of anonymous subjects and titled them after the people's occupations or class position or family position. So there are people with titles like the bricklayer or middle class family or things like that. And I wrote about 45 poems in response to these photographs, and in the book the poems and photographs face each other on facing pages. For me, that was really a sort of one-off thing. I think that it was particularly the historical circumstances of those photographs, because they were taken in Germany in the first half of the 20th century, and all the different resonances that has, gave me a lot to think about and a lot to write about. I don't think that I know a lot about photography in general, and I don't consider myself a person who would sort of ordinarily write about photography, but I think something about these particular photographs spoke to me. I don't know if I would ever do it again, but I'm glad I did it once. Yeah.
So one difference, I think, between some of these earlier Jewish writers and contemporary Jewish writers is their familiarity and steepness in Jewish tradition. So even earlier generations of secular Jewish writers came from homes in which Jewish language was spoken, which prayer was still, ringing in your ears in some sense.
Yeah.
So are today's younger Jewish writers, in some sense, less Jewish, and I mean, that's a meaningless question, but is there like a moral or aesthetic problem with that?
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting historical evolution, because the first generation that I talked about, people who were born in the United States to Yiddish-speaking parents, they wanted out. They wanted to get out of that parochial environment. They saw it as a corner, and the main event was somewhere else. And Alfred Kazin, in the memoir I mentioned before, Walker in the City, talks about feeling like a bullet shot out of a gun. That's how he wanted to get out of Brownsville, which was the Brooklyn neighborhood where he lived. And in the process of doing that, they threw a lot overboard. This was a generation of people who, and this isn't true of all American Jews, but it's true of a lot of the writers and intellectuals. They were interested in Marxism and they were interested in American literature. They were not interested in Judaism. By the time you get to contemporary Jewish writers like Jonathan Safran Foer or Nicole Krauss or Nathan Englander, or Dara Horn, I think that there's a real about face, and there's a realization among some of these writers who are my age, like about 40 years old, that they are growing up in an American Jewish culture that's precarious, and they actually feel like it needs to be preserved and that there needs to be a greater commitment to it. So among these writers, there's a much greater interest in Jewish text and tradition and in religion than there was in Philip Roth, for example. I mean, Roth is a great rationalist. For him, religion is just meaningless. It's nonsense, it's superstition, it's savagery. He talks about that in some of his books. Whereas writers like Foer actually edited a new Haggadah, which is something that you could never imagine someone like Philip Roth or Saul Bellow doing. So I think in an interesting way, there's been a return to Judaism because younger writers see it as something that it's their responsibility to preserve. Yeah.
It seems to me it's less natural than that, right? Like yourself, you're reading Talmud at the moment.
Yeah.
You talk about your unfamiliarity with Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
I mean, Roth and Bellow grew up in homes where it was just, and they were trying to escape it because they couldn't escape it.
Right. Well, I think that there are differences between Roth and Bellow. I think Roth grew up in a English-speaking home, but Bellow definitely grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. And he did escape it pretty well until fairly late in life. He didn't write much or have much interest in Judaism, and then there's a sort of evolution in his work where he sort of returned to it. I think that today there's a growing, as everyone talks about, there's a growing division in the American Jewish community between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. And in the Orthodox community, you find that knowledge of Hebrew and knowledge of tradition much more than in the non-Orthodox world. And a lot of these writers come out of the non-Orthodox world. So there are people who are conscious of their limitations, right? They're conscious of what they don't know. And definitely they're coming back to it in a spirit of, we wish we knew more. And they want to discover things, which I think is admirable, and it's the only way to do it, right? If you're not raised with it and you want to find out, then you have to make that effort. Yeah.
I just have a question. So you've spoken a little bit about this younger generation of Jewish writers returning to some of the religious elements of Judaism, even if not in a personal way, maybe as inspiration.
Yeah.
Do you see any of this younger generation returning to Jewish languages that aren't holy languages like Hebrew, like either Yiddish or Ladino or anything like that, as a source of inspiration as well?
I think that definitely Yiddish. Ladino I don't know as much about, and because most American Jews are Ashkenazi rather than Sephardic, although not all, obviously, but the majority. But definitely I think that there's an interest in Yiddish, but you have to be willing to commit a large part of your professional life to learning Yiddish, right? And so there are a few writers like Dara Horn is one example who actually, I think, did a doctorate in Yiddish and also writes fiction. So she has a foot in both worlds. Other people, I think, are interested in it and maybe interested in it in translation, want to read some of those writers, but obviously aren't fluent in Yiddish. And so it takes a big commitment. Like I said, to learn Hebrew or to learn Yiddish is a very big commitment, and most people aren't going to make that commitment. It's always going to be a minority, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you.
And I am fascinated and kind of horrified by the idea that of like Auschwitz being a source of spiritual authenticity.
Yeah.
Also, I guess my question is has to do with the point you were making about a kind of mystical bond between people and their language and the land and so on.
Yeah.
Culture. And I began to think about Dan Pages, or
Mm-hmm.
Pages, and
Yeah.
Paul Celan,
Mm-hmm.
and they're two very different choices. Paul Celan, who wrote in German, and Dan Pages, who wrote in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But he learned Hebrew late, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, as an adult.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had thought about them. I know they're not American writers, but
Yeah.
they're sort of the choice to return to Hebrew and the choice also not to return to Hebrew.
Well, yeah. So the question is about Jewish writers like Paul Celan, who wrote in what to them were native languages like German, he wrote in German, versus writers like Dan Pagus or Yehuda Amichai, who went to Israel and wrote in Hebrew. If you look at the percentage of Jews who emigrated from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920, which was when most of the emigration happened, the percentage that went to the United States versus the percentage that went to Palestine is like 90% to 1%. Very few people went to Palestine. The ones who did were mostly very committed Zionist ideologues. They were true believers in Zionism. My own great-grandfather went to Palestine before World War I, lived there for several years, and fought in the British Army during World War I, and then left and came to New York because it was too hard to live in Palestine. And a lot of people made that choice because it was very difficult to start a life there. I think the moral of that story is people will speak the language mostly where they are, and they will mostly go to places where it's easiest to live. And so that's why American Jewry has evolved the way that it has. I think it doesn't make any sense to be moralistic about it and to say, why haven't we kept up our Hebrew? Why don't we? I think that the forces working against that were very strong. And the forces of modernity that led to sort of an erosion of Jewish knowledge also led to an erosion of religious knowledge among many different groups of people. Religion everywhere is not as central to life as it was 500 years ago, right? So I think that the big experiment of American Judaism is how can we make a meaningful Judaism that is not based on these traditional identifications like language and land, which for most of Jewish history, if you were born into a Jewish community, that you had no choice in the matter. That was the community you were in, that was the language you spoke, those were the only people who you had access to, so there was no choice about leaving. It's interesting if you look at David Levinsky, the novel that I mentioned. One of the things that's documented in that novel is how incredibly fast the first generation of Jewish immigrants left behind their religion. Almost all of them left behind things like Shabbat observance and kashrut very, very easily. And I think it's because it was the first time in Jewish history when it was possible to be accepted into a society that was not a Jewish society, rather than being forcefully excluded. So we're in this very fortunate position. I mean, American Jews are the most fortunate Jews that ever lived in a lot of ways, but one of the challenges of that situation is if you want to remain Jewish in some way, you have to make an effort. It has to be a choice and a decision rather than in simply being the environment that you live in.
Probably a good place for us to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.